guys! Welcome to Talk to Rachel and welcome to Rachel's Book Club. Hoje a gente vai ver o segundo caso de Sherlock Holmes. E se você não acompanhou os 3 primeiros capítulos do nosso livro de leitura, The Return of Sherlock Holmes, corre lá no meu canal do YouTube, porque tem todos os detalhes lá. Junto com lá no meu grupo de Telegram, os detalhes de transcrição e glossário de cada capítulo. Está sendo muito legal e estou recebendo muito feedback positivo. Então corre lá você também participar desse Book Club. Juntos vamos aprender muito. Vamos para o nosso próximo caso do Sherlock Holmes. The Norwood Builder. There seems to be no interesting cases these days, Watson, Sherlock Holmes said to me. London isn't a very interesting place. I don't think the people of London will agree with you, I answered. He smiled as he pushed his chair back from the breakfast table. You're right, I mustn't be selfish. It is better for everybody if detectives like me have little work. I smiled too. The world did seem very quiet that morning. Sherlock Holmes sat back in his chair, picked up his newspaper and started reading. Suddenly, there was a loud knock on the front door. I heard the servant open the door. Then somebody ran into the house and up the stairs. He opened our door and stood in front of us. He looked very frightened. I'm sorry, Mr. Holmes, he cried. I must talk to you now. I can't wait. I'm John Hector MacFarlane. I'm sure that you know my name. Sit down, Mr. MacFarlane, said Holmes. No, I don't know your name, but I can see that you're an unmarried lawyer. The man seemed surprised at this, but it didn't surprise me. Holmes was a good detective, and even I noticed the man's untidy clothes and the lawyer's papers in his hand. That's true, Mr. Holmes, he replied, and it's also true that I'm the unhappiest man in London today. Please help me. The police are coming to get me. I'm sure that they followed me here. I'll go with them if you'll help me. The police are coming, said Holmes, who looked very happy. I knew that he was hoping for an interesting case. Then he remembered poor Mr. MacFarlane and said, I'm sorry. Mr. MacFarlane, this seems very interesting. Please tell me more. Why are the police looking for you? They think I killed a man. His name's Jonas Oldacre. The newspaper was still lying on the table, and our visitor picked it up. I noticed that his hands were shaking. Look at your newspaper, he said. You'll see why I've come to you, Mr. Holmes, he said. Look at this. Fire in Lower Norwood. Rich man disappears. Is he dead? Was he killed? I took the newspaper and looked at the report. The police, it said, wanted to find Mr. MacFarlane. They think I killed Mr. Oldacre for his money, said the poor man. What will my mother think? What can I do? I looked at Mr. MacFarlane carefully. He was a handsome man with fair hair, and he was probably about 27 years old. His clothes showed that he had plenty of money. Then I looked at Sherlock Holmes. His eyes were closed, so I read the newspaper report. It said, late last night or early this morning, there was a fire in Sydenham Road in Lower Norwood. The police are worried about Mr. Jonas Oldacre, the owner of the house. Mr. Oldacre is well known in the area. He made a lot of money as a builder, but has stopped doing building work. He is 62 years old, unmarried, and lives at Deep Dean House. He has few friends. Mr. Oldacre still keeps a lot of old wood at the back of his house. When a fire started there last night at about 12 o'clock, the wood burned fast. At first it seemed like an ordinary fire, but then someone noticed that the owner of the house was not there. In one room there were some important papers on the table and signs of a fight. A stick was found on the floor and also some blood. Mr. Oldacre had a visitor last night, a lawyer called John Hector MacFarlane. The police think that the stick belongs to him. There are also signs that something heavy was pulled through the grass from the house to the fire. Something, an animal or a person, was burned with the old wood. The police think that Mr. Oldacre was killed in his house. Then he was taken outside and burned. They are looking for Mr. McFarlane. Mr. Lestrade of Scotland Yard is working on the case. When I finished reading, Sherlock Holmes opened his eyes. "So why, Mr. McFarlane, haven't they found you yet?" he asked. "I live with my mother and father at Torrington Lodge in Blackheath," said Mr. McFarlane. "But last night I wasn't at home. I stayed at a hotel in Norwood because my visit to Mr. Oldacre finished very late. The police will try to catch me today. I think they'll come here for me." Suddenly there was another loud knock on the front door and we heard policemen's voices. 2 men waited outside and 1 joined us upstairs. It was our friend Lestrade, the detective from Scotland Yard. Lestrade looked straight at McFarlane and said, "John Hector McFarlane, you must come with us. We believe that you killed Jonas Oldacre last night." McFarlane stood up. His face was white. "Sit down," said Holmes, "and Mr. Lestrade, please sit down too." "But I must take Mr. McFarlane away," said Lestrade. "Half an hour won't matter to you," replied Holmes, "and Mr. McFarlane wants to tell us what happened last night." "Well, Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade, "because you're my good friend, I'll wait for half an hour, but no more." "Thank you," said Holmes. Then he asked Mr. McFarlane to tell us his story. Mr. McFarlane began. "Yesterday morning I knew nothing about Mr. Oldacre except his name. He was a friend of my mother and father a long time ago, but not now. I was very surprised when he came to my office yesterday. I'm a lawyer. Mr. Oldacre showed me some papers, his will, which I have here. He asked me to make a good copy of the will. He wanted to wait, so I began the work. I soon saw, to my surprise, that he wanted to give me all his money after his death. I asked him why he wanted to do that. He explained. He had no children, but he knew my father, so he wanted me to have the money. Of course, I thanked him for his great kindness, but I was still very surprised. I made the copy as quickly as possible. Finally, it was finished. He asked me to go to his house that evening to see more important papers. His last words to me were, "Please don't tell your mother and father. I want this to be a surprise for them." Mr. Oldacre was being very kind to me. I wanted to do exactly what he said. So I sent a message to my parents. I had important business after work, I said. I told them not to worry if I did not come home. Mr. Oldacre asked me to be at his house at 9 o'clock, but I couldn't find it. I didn't arrive until 9:30. Mr. Oldacre— "Stop," said Holmes. "Who opened the front door?" "An old woman. I think she worked for Mr. Oldacre." "And did she know your name?" "Yes," replied the young lawyer. "Then she took me into a room. There was a simple meal waiting for me on the table. I ate some of the food and then Mr. Oldacre came and took me to another room. He had a lot of papers in a cupboard there and we worked on these together for a long time. We didn't finish until about 11:30. Mr. Oldacre told me to leave quietly by the back door because the old woman was asleep. When I was leaving, I couldn't find my stick, but Mr. Oldacre said, "That doesn't matter, my boy. You can get it another day. I hope you're going to visit me very often." When I left, the cupboard was open. The papers were still on the table, and I couldn't go back to Blackheath. It was too late. So I stayed at Alney Arms in Norwood. I didn't know about all this until I read the paper this morning. Mr. McFarlane stopped speaking, and Lestrade said, "Have you any more questions, Mr. Holmes?" "No, I want to go to Blackheath first," said Holmes. "Don't you mean Norwood?" asked Lestrade. "Perhaps I do," replied Holmes, and he smiled at Lestrade. Holmes often understood things more quickly than Lestrade, and the police detective knew this. Lestrade turned to Mr. McFarlane and said, "There are 2 policemen waiting outside for you. You must go with them now." The policeman took Mr. McFarlane away. His face was still white, and he looked at us sadly, but he said nothing. Então esse foi o próximo caso. Começa o próximo caso de Sherlock Holmes. Se você quer assistir os primeiros capítulos do primeiro caso, você pode encontrar isso lá no meu canal do YouTube. Esse capítulo sobre o novo caso dele vai ter um quiz amanhã sobre o que aconteceu e também hoje no grupo de Telegram vai ter um glossário e transcrição desse capítulo, ok? Então eu espero que vocês gostarem. Lembre de deixar seu like, comentário e inscrever no canal. E a gente se vê o que vai acontecer. Será que a gente vai descobrir quem matou essa pessoa, Mr. Oldacre? Será que ele está morto? Vamos descobrir na próxima parte dessa história. See you soon, guys!